Welcome to the Interview Prep Workshop. My name is Jesse. I'm an employment specialist. Shout out to our host, Works4You Employment. Let's get started. So today's topic, we're going to talk about reasons why hiring managers make the hiring decision. We're going to talk about types of interviews. Specifically, we're going to go into depth on virtual interviewing as well as in-person interviews during COVID. We're going to talk about preparing for interviews. We're going to touch on interview strategies, and we're going to talk about what to do in the post-interview. Note, this is going to be a two-part series. We will not be talking about how to answer interview questions. We will be going into that discussion in a separate workshop or part 2 of this interview series. Dalhousie University did this study with personnel managers and hiring managers to come up with the 7 most common reasons why they made the hiring decision. And here were their results. Number 1, they answered interview questions well. Basically, they took time to practice and prepare for the interview well, and this made a big difference. In our resume workshop, I said that the resume was designed to get you the interview, and that's because here is where the battle for being hired is won or lost, is during the interview step. Number 2, showed enthusiasm in the interview. I once went for a group interview for the opening of the Microsoft store in Yorkdale Mall. And I thought I would do well. I was a new business grad and I could learn quickly, and I was just ready to get out there and conquer the world. But what I very quickly learned when I showed up for the interview is that there were IT professionals willing to quit their 5-year-long career in a good company just for the chance to go work for Microsoft and then move up the ladder. And they knew every facet of every product. They knew everything that was happening with the company. And to me, Microsoft was a cool company, but it was still just a company. And predictably, I did not get a second interview. And the people that I'd spoken to who really knew their stuff and were very good at showing their enthusiasm, they all got second interviews. Number 3, appeared professional. So this has to do with looking the part. I see this as more of an expansion on the first point. So does it feel like you're in the role? Do you look the role? Do you have the manners? Handshake? Did you know the answer to your questions? So you had this professional vibe about you that shows that you could fit into the role. Number 4, experience and qualifications. Earlier, I've mentioned a few times that some candidates have gotten jobs because they had an asset, and that was sometimes the primary reason why someone didn't get a job. So knowing what you bring to the table that other people don't have can be a deciding factor. Number 5, ability to fit the company image. This is why it's good to do your research on what the company image is. What do they wear? How do they talk? You can get a lot of this information during informational interviews with professionals that are in that company or people who do similar type of work in maybe other companies. Number 6, appeared mature. I feel this is more of a rehash of number 3. And finally, number 7, showed knowledge of the job and the company. When you do that in an interview, it shows that this is not just another company to you, but you're looking to invest your time in that particular company. And when you invest your time to do research, it increases the chances that a company will then in turn invest in you. So from that, I drew 5 themes or 5 actionable steps that you can use to get hired. And number 1 is interview well. So you want to do practice and preparation so that you can answer the questions well. Number 2, talk about your passion. When I have spoken about cover letters in the past, I've talked about your why story and really capturing that in the cover letter. This is a great place to reiterate some of that stuff is during the interview. Appear professional again. So this is about taking the research and informational interview results and moving that forward and actually taking it to implement and actually looking the part. What do they talk about? How do they speak? What clothes do they wear? Those sorts of things. Number 4, you want to talk about the assets that you have. This can make a real difference. And finally, number 5, you want to research the company. In order to share knowledge of the job in the company, you have to first get the knowledge of the company or the role. So that might be you taking notes, you taking a look at their website, going for informational interviews. We're going to talk a little bit more later about where you can go to get information and what sorts of things are good to know. So let's talk a little bit about the interview process. So being in the recruitment and employment industry for as long as I have, I would say that the vast majority of interview processes go something like this. There are always variations to a degree, but I would say most of them more or less fit within this process. Number 1 is a general phone screener. And the reason that recruiters do a general phone screener is because some people just click apply and they really haven't read the posting in any great detail. So this is basically a step to make sure that the company is interviewing candidates that actually know what they're doing and really are interested in the job. Number 2 is the first interview. This is usually introduction to a hiring manager or an HR manager, and it's a basic assessment of your skills as they apply to the job, more or less. This is where the classic questions come. Tell me about yourself. What is your greatest weakness? Why should we hire you? That's where a lot of the classic interview questions are asked. Even questions that are behavioral based, so star story based questions, which we'll talk about in the interview question workshop. And finally, the second interview. These have scenario-based questions, technology, testing, mock presentation, assessments. This is much more of a deep dive into the skills, and it's basically meant to differentiate one candidate over another, which is really important if you have 3 or 4 really good candidates and an employer is trying to decide between them. Now let's talk about types of interviews. I spoke earlier about informational interviews in our networking workshop. If you're interested in learning more about that particular type of interview, which is one that you set up, please check out our networking workshop in the description below. Then there's the telephone interview. And again, this is mostly a screening over the phone. It's sometimes 10 to 15 minutes long. It's fairly short in duration, is now being used a little bit more commonly for other types of interviews, especially during the time of COVID. Group interviews. So these are interviews of 5 or more candidates for a particular job. Maybe it's for the attraction industry, or maybe it's a new location opening, and they're doing lots and lots and lots of interviewing. And this is a very effective way to interview lots of candidates very quickly. In fact, sometimes what they'll do is they won't ask everybody an identical question. They'll ask one candidate a question, and they'll ask another candidate a question, and then they'll just put it out to the group. Do you agree with what other people have said in this interview? There's in-person interviews, and this is the one that people most commonly think of, where you meet one-on-one with a hiring manager or recruiter to discuss the position in depth and your skills and qualifications as it applies to the job. Next is panel interviews. So this is 3 or more managers. They could be a cross-functional team, so it might be a recruiter, an HR manager, and the hiring manager, or it might be a position that's split between multiple departments. Therefore, you have the managers from multiple departments, or it could be project managers. And finally, video and virtual interviewing is done over the internet using video technology. Could be Zoom, could be Microsoft Teams, could be Skype. There's a number of different softwares, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that in detail, as it is more commonly used right now during the time of COVID. So when you're setting up your virtual interview set, you want to think of it as a movie shoot. Lights, camera, action. Seriously, when it comes to lighting, you don't want to have the lighting behind you because this will just silhouette your figure. What you really want is lighting behind the camera, but not obstructed by the camera, so that you are well lit in the shot. You want to take into consideration things that are within the shot of your camera. So is there a lot of sound in the background? You should take some time to remove any clutter that might be behind you or unprofessional items and so forth. You want to consider your posture. So is your mouth and eyes and your face generally in the center to upper third of the screen. I've included a good photo from Zoom on what that looks like. Now, your audience should see your upper body to just above your head in terms of frame. Now, I know some people can't sit in that position for very long, so it is okay to move around a little bit, but generally speaking, that is a good image for your virtual interview. You also want to consider your physical location in terms of stable Wi-Fi or LAN connection. So LAN is the wire that goes into your computer. Wi-Fi is wireless. LAN is always more secure than Wi-Fi. So you might consider taking that into account when it comes to setting up for a virtual interview, especially if your Wi-Fi is not always the most reliable. Other virtual interviewing tips. So you want to make sure, if you're someone like me who has children at home, that they will not be a distraction during your interview. So you want to have activities that will keep the kids busy for a specific period of time, strategic use of TV, and you want to communicate to other family members that you have important meetings or interviews so that they don't walk in on you and interrupt your meeting. So communication in your household is very key to doing virtual interviews. Also, you want to wear professional clothing. Just because you're at home doesn't mean that you're not at work. So again, the same rules as for what you would go to in an interview setting also apply to the virtual interview. And the equivalent of showing up to an office 15 minutes early would be to download the software in advance and test it out. That way there's no surprises or delays when your interview begins. So we'll talk for a second about in-person interview etiquette. First things first, if you are going for an interview and you show up at the office, please greet the receptionist. I could not tell you how many people have ruined their interviews because they didn't consider just proper etiquette with the person at the front desk. Remember to smile. I know this is one that a lot of people think, yeah, it's obvious that you smile, but it really can make a difference in your tone when you're talking. So you want to make sure that you are, in fact, smiling because it brings out that enthusiasm. Good posture during the interview. If you're slouching, it doesn't bring around that nice professional vibe. Now, when it comes to answering interview questions, it's okay to take a pause for a second before answering or to consider your answer. A lot of people, when they're nervous, talk really fast. And even taking that pause just might slow down your presentation enough that it doesn't appear that way. It's okay to ask an interviewer to restate the question or even defer the question. Partly because the purpose of an interview is to get to know you and assess the fit for a company. And if you're stuck on a particular question for that particular moment, just ask, hey, have a good answer for it. Can we just come back to that in a minute? Don't bring any items with you that you wouldn't want to bring in with you to the interview. You are to be focused on the interview and nothing else should take away from that. So no shopping bags, no coffee cups or gum. Don't wear heavy scented products. These are things that really can detract from your interview. Now, during the pandemic, and I'm sure even for a small time after the pandemic, I would actually ask, what is the procedure for visiting the office when they tell you that you have an in-person interview? Do they want you to social distance, wear masks, and so forth? These are some things that are common to us right now, but it's always good to just ask, what is the procedure when visiting the office? Are you going to take our temperature? Do you have contact tracing? It's just good to be informed about what to expect when you walk in the door. And this way, it doesn't throw you for a loop when it happens, and you can focus then afterwards on the interview itself. So when preparing for an interview, you want to put together your interview toolkit, which should have a pen, paper, notes on the company that you've written down, your actual application, the job posting itself, a copy of your references, and an extra copy of your resume for each interviewer, and always one for you. And that could also be the application that you put forward. When you're doing this virtually, it's much easier because you can just shoot an email or pop it in the chat. These are all functions that you can use with your toolkit. You want to look up your interviewer on LinkedIn. This will give you an idea of the person's background so that you can customize your responses to someone. You can also see if you have anything similar, something that you can make a connection with an interviewer with. For phone screening, you want to have a quiet place, ideally in front of a mirror, so that when you're talking, the mirror reminds you to smile. Dress for success. What I mean by that is you want to dress better than what the job would require you to do on a daily basis. So whatever their dress code is, you want to go a step up. And if you're not sure, it's always better to go a step up of what you think it is, because it's always easier to dress down than it is to dress up. What do I mean by that? Well, if I go to an interview that I'm wearing a suit and a tie and people are walking in with jeans, it's easier for me to just take off the tie at the interview than it is to put one on. So it's much easier to dress down. Also, you want to lay out your clothes the day before. Again, you want to be focused on your interview and not panicking to do laundry the day of the interview. This is a time for you to reduce stress and be focused on what you need to say. Now, this next part is subject to COVID protocols. So please bear in mind that this was advice that was given prior to the pandemic, and I'm mentioning it now for post-pandemic, but you should also take into consideration your local area's lockdown procedures. So generally speaking, you want to arrive at the local coffee shop 30 minutes prior to the interview. And the reason is that if you are running late, you won't be late for the interview. If you arrive exactly 30 minutes before the interview, you have time to review your resume and the application. It gives you just that extra time for review. You want to arrive at the actual place of interview 15 minutes beforehand. This is to deal with any issues of getting lost or going to the wrong room. You want to make sure you're in the right place at the right time. So plan to be in the actual office 15 minutes prior to. Again, this is subject to COVID protocols because some places don't want you sitting around for 15 minutes, especially during the time of COVID. Clean up your social media from like the dawn of time. If you go through the last couple of years and just take out everything from the last couple of years, then anyone who's looking at your social media profile will have their images starting from a few years ago. So you want to make sure that you clean all of it, not just some of it. And finally, when it comes to interview preparation, you want to spend some time practicing with a friend, going over questions that you find difficult so that you are well practiced and it flows naturally when you're in the interview. Now, when it comes to interviewing strategy, I like to take a page from Sun Tzu, which is know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles, you will never be in peril. So the first part of that is to know the employer. Learn about the employer. This allows you to hit the ground running in an interview. You want to be talking about solving problems for the employer, not qualifying yourself for the job. That's what your resume should have already done. So again, you want to be proactive instead of reactive. You also want to ask questions in the interview that will help you learn more about the job and what are the deeper needs of the employer. I have a model for this. It's called the 3 R's of interviewing an employer: relate, reveal, review. I will be going over that in the next workshop. Researching the company. So you want to go over a number of different things to really get to know the company. I'll go over some good questions to do for research in a second, but you want to look at their history. You want to look at them in the news, and you want to get a sense for their branding, for what they're known for. Now, when it comes to knowing yourself, you want to practice interview questions that help you talk about yourself. And you want to take some time to do some deep reflection. Nothing ruins an interview faster than giving a whole bunch of cliche internet responses to questions, because it doesn't move you forward in the process. And if you come off fake in an interview, it's the fastest way to lose the job. So when you're conducting research into an employer, there's a number of questions you can ask yourself. What is this employer known for? Is their company associated with any brands? Are there noteworthy parts in their history? A question I always ask when prepping someone for an interview is, what is cool about this employer? So this is where you can link passion, your passion, to the employer. Do they have any corporate social responsibility? So what are they doing for the community? Has the company set any goals? You can take a look. Some companies have a newsroom where they'll actually post what their stock targets are and all that kind of stuff. You can actually go and look and see what are their goals and think about how can your role contribute to them making their goals. How much does this particular job pay? They may ask questions around salary. You also want to look at, are you working with teams, customers, stockholders? So you want to look at the type of people that your job will be interacting with. So when you are putting together your reference sheet, you want to pick professional references over character references. So people you've worked with as opposed to people that can just testify to your character, because they can give more relevant information on the work that you've done. You also want to have 5 ready to go, but you only want to give 3. And the reason is this allows you to be more strategic about the references that you can give. Also, you want to be mindful that people can go on vacation and might not be available to give a reference. There are people that move companies, and sometimes phone numbers or emails can change over time. So you want to be very wary about giving references. Also, the more up-to-date references you have, so the more recent, the better. You always want to ask permission before you give out any information on a reference sheet. And there's a few reasons for this. Number one, you should be briefing your reference on the job that you're going for so that they can illustrate or tailor their responses in the same way that you practice for an interview. Just allows them to have that flexibility so that they can give more, especially if they're a really good reference for you. So with that, I'll talk about the format in which you give the reference. So you want the person's name, you want the title that they have and the company that they've worked for, their phone number, email, and just a brief description of how are you affiliated with them, especially if they're a character reference. Add some context for the interviewer. So let's talk about post-interview. You always want to send a thank you note or card for follow-up. And when you are composing this thank you note, you want to reflect on what happened during the interview. What was something that you enjoyed from the interview that was a really good moment that you connected? And you want to send this thank you note within the first few hours after the interview or early the next morning of the next day. Anyway, rule of thumb is always within 24 hours. And the reason that it's good to do this is you're actually reminding the interviewer of how well your interview went. So you do want to focus on something that was a highlight from that interview, like I did in the example below. So, and I stole this one from a movie. So bonus points if you know which movie this comes from. But dear Miranda Priestley, thank you for taking the time to interview me for the position of personal assistant. I enjoyed our discussion on upcoming fashion trends and high-end brands. At this time, I'd like to reconfirm my commitment to the position. Thank you for your consideration. Now, when it comes to feedback, there's a few things to remember. So one, 80% of the time when a person doesn't get the role, it's got absolutely nothing to do with them. So that's first and foremost. I know a lot of people sit there and say, I didn't get the position because of, I didn't answer this question well, or I didn't get the position because I didn't talk about this. In reality, only one person can get the job. And if they're interviewing 5 top candidates, that means 80% don't get the job. In addition to that, there are other factors that can contribute to someone not getting the position. For example, the position can be canceled. Sometimes the company has decided to move in a different direction. There could be a hiring freeze, like what we saw at the beginning of COVID-19. Most companies put on a hiring freeze because they didn't know where they were heading at that particular time. Sometimes a person has a skill that the employer didn't know they needed. And that has nothing to do with you. That has everything to do with what they can offer. So again, take these things into consideration when you're thinking to yourself, oh, I messed up somewhere, or I require feedback. Most employers do not necessarily share feedback about how well you did in an interview, which is why it's good to always debrief after having an interview with an employment specialist for more of an objective point of view on what occurred. So an excellent tool that I love to give clients if they're having a real hard time after an interview is something called a thought record. And basically it has several categories. It's used extensively in CBT, but it works very well as a tool for post-interview worries and concerns. So it starts off by writing the situation. So what happened? What are my thoughts about it? How do I feel about this interview? Am I doing anything that's negative as a response to my feelings about it? And what is the more balanced perspective? So, and I'll read the first one as an example. I had an interview with ABC company. I know I messed up one of the questions. I'm really frustrated because I had a great answer for that and I kind of froze, and I know I can do better. So right now I'm blaming myself. But it's important to remember that no one has a perfect interview, which is why we insist that people practice so that they can get better at it. So it's not going to be the last interview of all time. And sometimes employers will interview you for other positions as well. So even if you didn't get the position, there are still other opportunities. So let's not forget that. And you take it as a learning experience and you can move on. That's provided that you didn't get the job. This might be something where right after, you're in that waiting period and you're just reviewing all the things that are wrong. Another person might know that they didn't get the job and their thoughts are, I must have done something wrong in the interview. I don't know what it is. And now I'm going to be worrying, is it something that I'm getting wrong in every interview? You know what? Only one person can get the job, and another person might have had another skill. They might have been the internal candidate. It could have been any number of reasons. So it's important to have a balanced perspective when going through the post-interview process. So in summary, we talked about the reasons why hiring managers hire. We talked extensively about the interview processes and the types of interviews. We went over virtual and in-person interviewing during COVID. We talked about how to prepare for interviews. We talked about strategy. We went over the post-interview and thank you notes and references. And then we finished off by talking about thought records. That's it for our interview preparation workshop. If you're interested in learning more about a different type of interviewing, mainly informational interviewing, please check out our link in our description to our networking workshop. Join us next time for our part 2 of interviews, talking about the different interview questions. If you enjoyed today's content, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell for more notifications. Thank you to our host, Works4You Employment, who has granted us the ability to post content on their site. See you guys next time.